So the news for today is that we have two major discussion points. One of them is PKI, the public key infrastructure, and all the items related to it. And the other one is shellshock. Have you heard about it? If you heard about shellshock, raise your hand. Well, 2 out of 10. It's better than 0 out of 10. Shellshock is a fresh exploit in Bash, which allows a remote attacker to execute arbitrary code with the privileges of the user who's running Bash on a target system. And when I say arbitrary, I mean any code. So for example, if you have Apache running as root, and somewhere deep inside Apache you have certain parts of your code performing actions in Bash, then a remote attacker can execute anything they want as a root user. So that's what shellshock is about. It has surfaced maybe a week ago, and it made a huge fuss on the internet, just like Heartbleed did a couple of months ago. The difference is that this one is much more simple. It doesn't require a lot of putting things together, components and tweaking to make it work. Anyone can exploit this loophole in Bash without too much effort. So that's what shellshock is about. Are you intrigued? Well, that's good. But we'll start with PKI because that's what I had in mind for today. And we will review certain things we discussed last time. So if we have two people, A and B, and we want to exchange messages between them such that A knows that the message they got from B is really from B, and B knows that the message they got from A is really from A, and then nothing in that message has changed. So we discussed this scenario, and I'm going to ask you to remind me how exactly it works. What kind of cryptographic primitives we can use to accomplish those requirements? Hashing. So what exactly? You make a joint, you puff up some smokes, and B knows that the message came from A? How exactly do we use hashes?
You hash the document you want to send or the information together with the secret keyword that only the two people in the conversation should know, or only the exclusive people should know.
Mm-hmm.
Together, you send the information with the hash, with the what's it called?
So wait a second. Let me write down what you just said. You have your message.
Yeah.
Then you concatenate it with some secret.
Yeah.
Then you hash this thing.
And you get the
Message authentication code.
No, the digest, yeah.
Okay, so this is your digest.
And then we send the message with the digest to the receiver.
Mm-hmm. So anyone who knows this secret can prove to the recipient that I really know the secret. Mm-hmm. And this works if you have multiple actors and you want to exchange between more than one entity. But let's say we have just these two actors. was a method to achieve this using asymmetric cryptography.
Public and private key?
Yeah, but
when
he raised his hand.
encrypt the message, the sender encrypts the message with his private key,
Mm-hmm.
and then encrypts the message with the receiver's public key, and the receiver decrypts the message with his private key, and then he takes the public key of the sender and decrypts them.
Mm-hmm.
The second level of encryption.
Okay, let me write this down. So you encrypt the message with the sender's
Private key.
sender private key. Then
Encrypt the message with the receiver's public key.
you encrypt the message or the result of this operation.
The result.
Okay, let's call it M prime. So then you encrypt M prime with
Receiver's public key.
Mm-hmm.
Send the message. The M.
Let's call it M2. And then you send this
Yeah.
to the recipient. Then the recipient uses their secret key, which is entangled with this public key, so they know how to decrypt this. Then they use the sender's public key to decrypt this, and they obtain that. So between these two players, there is consensus. So they have previously exchanged keys, they know about each other, and they are happy. Now imagine that A and B are some businesses conducting transactions on the internet. And A agreed to give 500 kilograms of cheese to B in return for $100, for example. And the money was paid, but they only sent 50 kilograms of cheese, not 500. And B tells A that you made a mistake, you have to correct it and send me 450 kilograms of cheese as we have agreed. And I can confirm that we agreed to do that because you have encrypted that message where you promised to send me 500 kilograms of cheese with your private key, so only you had this key. Nobody else could have signed that message. Well, I said signed, but let me just say nobody else could have encrypted that message with your secret key because you're the only one who has it. And if A and B are decent people with a code of conduct, with some decency and honor in their conscience, then this works out. But at some point, A can say, you know what, this never happened. You just made this up. So B says, you know what, I'm going to take this to court. So now the challenge is to prove to a judge that at some point in the past, A said what is claimed that they said, and that B said what B said. In other words, we introduce a third party, let's call it the judge, and let me explain the problem again. So far, we only had two agents, A and B, and they could verify each other. Did you really send that message? Did you really send that message? Was it modified in transit? Yes or no? They could answer those questions. But now we have another problem. There is a third party, a judge, who has to answer the question, did A really send that message? without having anything to do with this entity or that entity. Is it clear what the problem is?
So the judge doesn't know anything about the data was encrypted with a private key or it was encrypted by the private key. He just knows that there was a message sent from A to B.
Mm-hmm.
Figure it out.
Yeah. Plus, let's go back to the original scenario when there is no judge.
Okay.
So A has two keys and B has their key pair. At some point, A can just say, you know what, I never had two keys. You just made all this stuff up. I never agreed to send you any keys. I never encrypted anything with my private key. What are you talking about? And there is nothing you can do about it. It's just your word against their word. There is no way to formally prove to somebody else, like a judge, that this dialogue had really taken place. Hence, we have this new problem. There is a third party that must be able to verify that this transaction was authentic. Before I tell you how this works, maybe you have some ideas. You could suggest some scenarios. Okay, silence means there are no suggestions. Then let me start handing out clues one by one. In this scenario, when there is just A and B, you can be an abstract entity. You don't have to know that my name is Alex, that I live here, that my age is so-and-so. I can pretend to be, let's say, user 46B in some system. And this other person can have the nickname Pink Zebra 1984, which is just a pseudonym, not tied to any concrete piece of matter from the real world, like this or that. So this is just an abstract entity, not a real person. There is no problem. You can generate a key pair for this one, and you can generate a key pair for this one. They can exchange their public keys, and then they can start exchanging data between them in privacy. But when you take it to a judge, you can't say, well, Pink Zebra 1984 promised me 500 kilograms of cheese. The judge will say, so who the hell is Pink Zebra 1984? And who are you to ask anyway? So the first step is that you have to somehow tie this identity to a known entity in society. It's not the only way to do it, but it's one way to do it. So this brings us to the concept of a certificate, that of a CA, which stands for Certification Authority. Well, we might also need these. I will tell you later what this stands for. So let's start with certificates. If you want your certificate to have legal power or legal value, I don't know what's the proper term, let's say legal power. Then this certificate must be issued by a CA that is trusted or somehow defined in the laws of this given country, that whatever certificate is issued by this specific CA will have legal power on the territory of a specific country. So let's write this as well. A certificate begins with a so-called CSR, Certificate Sign Request, which is a set of data that contains information about the owner of this certificate or the holder. This information could be your name, your address, your phone number, your email, etc. It also includes your public key. So at some point you have to generate a key pair. You include the public key in the certificate. And then you sign this thing with your secret key or your private key. And before on, I must make a small remark. It may have already happened once. I sometimes say you sign something with your private key when in fact I also mean that you encrypt something with your private key. And the reason I sometimes use these terms interchangeably is because if I encrypt something with my private key, it's similar to putting a signature on it, which confirms that it's really me, because I am the only one who knows my private key. So if you encrypt something with your private key, someone can decrypt it with your public key, so they can answer the question, was this thing really encrypted by person so-and-so? And if they can properly decrypt it with the public key, then the answer is yes. Which is why you may sometimes catch me using sign and encrypt with the private key interchangeably. So you make this data structure, you sign it with your private key, and you send this request to a CA. A CA is a piece of software that processes different requests, among them CSRs. There is a protocol that defines how this works. It's called CMP, Certificate Management Protocol. It is defined in some RFC, so it's open to the public. You can have a look. You send this request to the CA. It's going to process it somehow. For example, they can parse this data structure. They can extract the address, and they can use some database ran by the state to verify if there is indeed a person with that name at this address with the following phone number and email address. If there is, then they can go ahead and issue the certificate. You have a question?
The public key in the CSR, is it encrypted as well, or it's simply appended?
It's appended. You don't encrypt. Okay, so there's one thing I must also make. When I say sign some piece of data, you have this data, you hash it, you encrypt, so let's say this is H. You encrypt H with your private key. And the result of this operation is a signature. And then you take this signature and you append it to the end or to the beginning of your data structure. It depends on how the data structure is formatted. So to go back to your question, when I signed this structure, I didn't encrypt it. I hashed it, I encrypted the hash, and I appended the result of this operation somewhere to my data structure. So that's what I mean when I say sign. Now you know the whole truth. And this has several implications. First of all, the CA can read the data here. Because if it were encrypted, it would have to know the public key. But if I strike that, I'm going to take the previous sentence back. Do you have any other questions up to this point? Well, I guess that's a no. Now you're probably asking yourself some questions about this structure. There is a thing called ASN1, Abstract Syntax Notation 1. It's a way to serialize binary structures of an arbitrary complexity, or not just binary structures. So you can have any data structure and turn it into some binary data that you can put into a wire and send to some other party on the internet or any other network. They will then use an ASN1 decoder to transform it back into something like this, process it, and do something about it. And this format specifically is called X509. So if you look at, so any certificate issued to a web server that runs HTTPS is you can call it an X509 certificate. So you can look up the standard and see what exactly these fields are. There are a lot of them. Some are optional, some are mandatory. There are also a bunch of flags which I omitted here. For example, certain flags indicate what this certificate is supposed to be used for. Authentication, encryption, encrypting emails, signing other certificates, and so on. So there are a number of flags which can be set or not set. And you can find out all those details by looking up this standard. Now let's go back to the CSR. There are multiple formats of this data structure. For example, one of them is PKCS. I think it's PKCS10. It's one format. Then there's another one called SPKAC. And there's another one called CRMF. Now let me tell you a few things about them. PKCS is something used by Internet Explorer. Well, not just Internet Explorer, but it's what Internet Explorer uses. So if you want to request a certificate using some web interface, for example, you have to generate a CSR. And if you use the API provided by Windows, then this is what it will produce, a data structure of this format. This thing, on the other hand, has been invented by Netscape many, many years ago. Nowadays, this format is what is used by, in HTML there is a tag called keygen. If you introduce it into a web page, it will render a little button called generate along with a drop-down list where you can choose the key length. So how many bits you want the key to have. So if you include this tag, you'll have that. When you press the button, it will generate a base 64 encoded string, which can be parsed if you read what is this thing keeping inside of it. And CRMF is another format for certificate sign requests. This one is used in Firefox. So let's sum it up. SPKAC is used by the keygen tag, which is a part of the HTML standard. Not a lot of browsers actually support it, but the ones who do are Opera, Chromium, Chrome, Safari, and I also use it with Chrome on Android, and it works. This one, CRMF, works with Firefox, and this one works in Internet Explorer of all different flavors. I mean, not just the latest versions, but the old ones too. I must also point out that you should not be trapped into thinking that only a browser can generate a certificate signing request. No, that is not the case. You can use specialized tools to generate such data structures. One of them is OpenSSL. Or it can be your own piece of code that you wrote. For example, there is a library called Bouncy Castle. It's for Java and C#. It provides a lot of cryptographic primitives, among them the ones necessary for generating such requests. There is also OpenSSL, not just as a program on its own, but there are libraries that expose the OpenSSL API. For example, in Python, there is a library called M2Crypto, which exposes the OpenSSL API in a more or less Pythonic fashion. So when this request reaches the CA, it processes it somehow, then it sends you back a response, which contains your certificate signed by the CA. And I will comment that shortly, but before I do that, let me say a few things about what happens in these arrows here. The CA has to verify the data here and then issue the certificate. When the CA does that, it basically says, I, as a CA, confirm that this data are authentic, and I confirm this by signing this certificate with my private key, so anyone can verify this And how do they verify it? They see that it's signed by the CA, so they then ask themselves the question, do I trust this CA or not? So let me write down one more keyword, trust. So sometimes you can do this just by looking up some strings in the database, but in other cases, like it is the case here in this country, when you receive the CSR over CMP, you send them back a response saying something like, your request is being queued. Now you have to come to our office and provide your passport, your this, your that, so they can really tie this data to a physical identity. And only then will CTS, Centrul de Telecomunicații Speciale, only then will they issue you a certificate that has your stuff in it. So they have to really verify that there is a passport with the same first name and last name, with the same metadata as you have written down in your request. Another thing that is interesting to know is that our country has a law, Legea despre semnătură digitală, which has been around at least since 2006, but you can double check that. What the law says is the following, that on this territory, right under my shoes, on this territory, the certificates issued by this entity have legal power, as well as certificates issued by CAs from other countries with which we have cooperation agreements in terms of digital signatures and certificates. And in the same way, our certificates are valid in other countries with which we have such cooperation agreements. Now, this implies several things. Obviously, this CA, this certification authority, has some grounds in this country, but they're not issuing certificates for people in China or France. In that country, there are other CAs that are taking care of these processes. So, this brings us to the idea of trust. Now, if you open your web browser, or if you go to your operating system settings, in Windows, if you go to Control Panel, Internet Options, Connection, Certificates, you will see a window with a number of tabs that have names such as personal certificates, trusted routes, trusted intermediate routes, but let's focus on this one. Trusted routes. Did anyone see this tab? Who knows what I'm talking about? Well, one person is better than no people, so if you have a computer, it's probably a good idea to have a look. Perhaps you can find some screenshots if you don't have the right software. So you have a CA which generated a certificate and signed it. It's called a self-signed certificate. So this certificate is associated with a secret key, which the CA keeps to the. But the certificate is shared with everybody. The certificate contains the public key, among other things. So this certificate is pre-written into your operating system by default, and you will be able to find it in this list. Now, there is some other CA, let's say of some really huge company like Microsoft. Let's call it MSCA, Microsoft CA, which is also trusted by default. So if you go to Windows, to your certificate management, you will see this certificate listed there, and so on. So there is a list of certificates that you trust by default, because that's the way things are. Now, imagine that this CA has issued a certificate to a person. So they have their own certificate. This pictogram represents the certificate. So this one is signed by the CA. Now this person is in some sort of a relationship with somebody else on this planet. For example, it could be A selling 500 kilograms of cheese to B. So they used this certificate. Let me mark that there is a public key here, which is associated with a private key that only exists in the mind of this person. Nobody else knows it. So I used this private key to sign a document in which I say, I promise to send you 500 kilograms of cheese as soon as you give me $100. I use this information. So I sign this document. I send it over to person B, and they have it. Now, if for some reason I say, and when I say I mean this entity here. If at some point they say, you know what, I never sent this document, I have no idea what you're talking about, you can say, hold on, wait a second. You signed this document with your secret key. Your secret key is associated with this certificate. This certificate was issued to you by this CA. And I can check that because the certificate is signed with the secret key of this CA. I trust this CA, either because it was by default present in my operating system, or because there is some law that says that this CA is empowered to issue certificates that have legal power in a given geographical area. Moreover, when this CA issued you the certificate, they used some verification process to ensure that this is really you, that this name is really yours, that this address is where you really live, and so on. They also asked for your passport and some other paperwork. So based on that, because this document was signed with your private key, and the certificate with which the key is associated was signed by this CA, then even the judge can say for sure that yes, it is clear to me that you really signed this document. You cannot deny it. There is this really important property called non-repudiation. Which means I cannot deny that something took place. And since I use my private key here, no one else except me knows it, because you see this bubble, this thought bubble is only in my head. No one else knew this private key. So the property of non-repudiation stands. Is it clear up to this point? More or less? Well, let me ask you some test questions to make sure this works. Now, perhaps this is a flawless scenario, and there is no way in which it could possibly be that somebody signed this message with my private key other than me. Is there any set of circumstances in which my private key can become known to somebody else? let's say, an evil person. Now this evil person knows the same information. How could this happen?
Maybe this evil person can hack into our computer and can have access to it.
Yeah.
If it's this private key that I thinking about.
So if someone hacked into our computer and the private key was kept in that computer as a plain text file, then anyone can get the private key. So obviously this implies that we should really take care of this secret information, because otherwise it is compromised. What else?
If you post that secret key by mistake,
Mm-hmm.
for example, to GitHub you by mistake put a secret key instead of public.
Yeah, this has happened. In fact, if you export the key to a file so you could use it somewhere else, it will be a base64 encoded file with the string begin RSA private key followed by the base64 data and then ending with end RSA private key. So if you go to Google and look for this specific string, you will find a bunch of places where someone somehow let it go out into the wild. And a while ago, someone had the idea to search GitHub for projects that have files that contain these strings. So that's how they discovered a lot of GitHub repositories that had such data available to the public. So let's get to this point. A CRL stands for Certificate Revocation List. And the purpose of this technology, or of this mechanism, is to have an index of certificates which were revoked by the CA for one reason or another. And you can do that by sending another CMP request with another form of data in it saying, I wish to revoke certificate so-and-so for the following reason, such as my secret key got stolen, I lost my secret key, the person who owns this certificate and the accompanying key died. Therefore, there is no way they can sign anything with this key any longer. As soon as this happens, the CA processes the request and updates the CRL by adding a new certificate to it. Each certificate has a serial number. So when the CA returns a certificate, in this data structure there is a serial number which is supposed to be an unsigned integer. It doesn't specifically say which interval. So it's a number between 1 and as far as you could possibly imagine. There is no limit on the number of bits in the number that represents the serial number. So in the CRL, you have lists of serial numbers of certificates which were revoked, along with the reason why they were revoked, such as key compromise, lost key, etc. So if this person has reasons to believe that their key got compromised, let's say somebody else has it, then they must tell the CA about it. There is a mechanism for that, the CRL, such that from the moment this certificate was revoked, it has no legal power any longer. The next keyword here, OCSP, it stands for Online Certificate Status Protocol. It solves pretty much the same problem as the CRL, but with one minor but important difference. In this case, the CRL keeps growing and growing and growing. So every time I want to perform a transaction, I receive a document signed by someone, I have to check their certificate serial number, download the CRL, and look for this serial number in this list. If it's not there, it means, okay, it's still valid, let's go ahead and do it. If it's there, then I reject it. Now, the problem is that this list grows longer and longer and longer and longer. At some point, you run into the problem of the distribution of CRLs. Moreover, it also generates other headaches, such as traffic. Each time I want to do something that involves a certificate, I have to download the whole CRL. Well, it's not megabytes in size, but it's still bigger than 0, and I have to download it every time a transaction is performed. And if you think about it, for example, when you use HTTPS websites, your browser has to verify that the web server is indeed the entity that it claims to be by retrieving its certificate and checking the validity of that certificate. Now, if you had to download this file every single time you open a website, it would cause minor increases in the time it takes for the website to react. Or you can compromise security in favor of speed and just don't look in the CRL, but then what's the point? Because you will trust a certificate without really ensuring that it's still valid. So OCSP resolves this problem because it transforms the way the question is asked. What happens here is that I ask the CA, give me all the list of the certificates which were revoked. It gives you that list, and you look up the number of the certificate you're interested in that list. Whereas in the case of OCSP, you say, hey CA, is certificate 1234B7 valid? And the CA sends you back a response saying, yes, it's valid, or no, it's not valid. So this has several side effects. One of them is that there is less data to be exchanged. Second is that in the case of a CRL, if I retrieve it, I know more than I need to know. I was interested just in finding out if this certificate was revoked, but now that I have the whole CRL, I know which other certificates were revoked. This might have some privacy implications or not. The point is that when the CA sends this much information to the inquiring client instead of just this, it is obvious that they shared more than was necessary. So, coming back to our scenario here. If this person's certificate was compromised, they could have used, or they must use OCSP. Oh, wait a second. They must use CMP to tell the CA to place their certificate in the CRL, such that from that moment on, if anyone retrieved the CRL, this certificate will be blacklisted. Or if anyone uses OCSP to ask the CA if this certificate is valid, the CA will say, no, it's not valid. So it's really important to keep this in mind. Now let's switch to some questions to verify how things were understood by you. My first question is, why are there certificates that a typical Windows system will trust by default?
Maybe for updates.
Okay, one of them is for updates. Oh, wait. Which updates?
Default system updates.
So Windows Update.
Yep.
Yes. So they can digitally sign their installers somehow. So when you download this file, you can verify if it really came from Microsoft or not. Okay, what else?
I guess we need at least one as a default, because if you don't have even that one, we don't know where to get those from. So let's say 10% of the population will actually know a trusted CA. But the other 90% that actually use the operating system will not know where to get the CA information from. So they just by default give you at least one of them.
In fact, this is a pretty long list. And there are some regulations that say what a CA must do to be listed there. And those requirements are pretty strict. You can't just pick a random CA from any lab in a university and say, you know what, from now on, we're going to become trusted by default CAs in Windows and whatever other piece of software you have in mind. And those requirements are very strict in terms of security. For example, one of them could be that the secret key must be kept on a machine that is not connected to the internet or any network at all, thus avoiding the possibility of compromise from remote vectors. But let's get back to that a little bit later when I tell you more things about trust. In the meantime, I think it's important to tell you what other attributes are present in a certificate, so you have a better idea of what to expect from it. So one of them is subject info, which is a structure that contains multiple attributes, such as CN, which stands for common name. For example, it could be John Smith. C stands for country. It could be Moldova. There is O, organization, and they can come from the Technical University of Moldova, and on and on. So these keywords here are again defined in a standard. Each of them has a so-called OID, object identifier, which is a dot-separated numerical string, such as 2.1.4.7. This corresponds to common name. 2.1.4.8 corresponds to country, etc. These numbers, I just made them up. I'm not guaranteeing that 2.1.4.7 is really common name, but it's something that looks like this. And you can have your arbitrary length of numbers. You don't have to have them as single digits. It could be something like this, and it's still a valid OID. There is an organization which manages OIDs and distributes them among those who want an OID. For example, if we make a piece of software that uses certificates and we want to have a custom attribute in this certificate, then that attribute has to have its own OID. So we could use some proprietary number here, set it, and it works. But it doesn't guarantee that other entities will know what to do with this OID when they encounter it, which is why it's a very good idea to register with the company that manages OIDs. They allocate one of them to your company. For example, the prefix 1.477.0.3. This one is, if you look it up in the registry, it will say this is assigned to company Technical University of Moldova. So anything that begins with this prefix, we can then extend it any way we want. For example, .1 means lectures, .2 means professors, .3 means grades, whatever. So you can come up with your own arbitrary structures, each of them having its own OID, object identifier. So there's the subject info. There is a validity period from to, saying that this certificate will be valid from December the 20th, 2014 until December the 20th, 2016. It, of course, has the public key that corresponds to the secret key which was used to sign the certificate signing request that was originally sent to the CA, which then returned this certificate. It also has a thumbprint, which is a hash of this whole data structure in a canonical form. And remember why it needs to be canonical? Well, if you don't, I will remind you. If you replace these two lines like this, then the meaning of the whole structure doesn't change, but the hash will already be different. So it's important to have some sort of a convention. How will you list these attributes before you hash them in order to generate the thumbprint? It also contains some flags that indicate which purpose this certificate can be used for, like signing email, encrypting data, signing other certificates, generating timestamps, etc. There is also a field with information about the issuer, that is the CA that gave you this certificate. Well, there might be a few other ones. It is important to bring out this one, which is extensions. An extension is a way to include arbitrary data into the certificate. If you want to use it for some specific purpose in your company, And you need some data in the certificate which is not, which doesn't fit into any of these standardized attributes, then you can use the so-called extensions, which have their OID. So when you parse a certificate, you reach this attribute, and then you begin to analyze it, and you see, oh, I got this OID inside an extension. And then, according to your own rules, you will parse that OID as you see fit. I also mentioned that there is a serial number in the certificate, which, according to the standard, has to be a non-negative integer. There is also a field called version, which indicates the format of this certificate. I told you that the format is X509, but this format has multiple revisions. So what is currently used in the wild is X509 v3. Now it's time to go back to this point here, trust. An interesting thing about these CAs is that you can build a chain of trust. So for example, let's say you have a super CA somewhere there, and I'm going to call it a root CA. This one doesn't necessarily issue certificates to people directly. It can issue certificates to another CA, let's call it sub-CA, and then sub-CA2, and so on. So this one doesn't give certificates to people, it only gives certificates to CAs. And these CAs, in turn, can have another intermediate CA, like this one, and these CAs can, let's say, give certificates to people directly. So in this case, we have a chain of trust. So let's look at this branch here. This person got a certificate from Microsoft CA, which in turn got its certificate from CA, which got it from sub-CA, and this one got it from the root CA. And let's say the judge who was there had never had any kind of connection with this CA or this one. But the judge trusts this one. Now, if they trust this root CA, then this trust will propagate downwards until it reaches this certificate. Why? Well, it's time for you to generate some answers.
Well, because it's common sense, because the upper root, the upper CA is more important and more secure than sub-CAs.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an upper CA in your trust list, then you definitely trust the lower CA.
Mm-hmm.
Because the upper CA knows what he's doing. You want to give a CA
Okay.
to someone.
And how do I know I can trust them? Well, when this CA issued the certificate to this one, it signed the issued certificate with its secret key. So we can really verify that this certificate was really given by this CA. When this CA gave a certificate to this one, this certificate was signed with the secret key of this CA, and that secret key is associated with the public key, which is a part of this certificate, which was verified by this CA. And they verified it by taking your passport, a blood sample, whatever means they could use to really make sure it's you. And so on. This CA did the same to this one, and they did the same when they gave a certificate to this person. And you can verify this entire chain by checking the signature of the higher standing CA. So if we have to verify this certificate, we look up in the field issuer information which CA issued it. And we see that it's this one. Then we take the certificate of this CA and we verify the signature of this certificate using the public key of the MSCA certificate. Using this, we can verify that the integrity of this certificate hasn't been compromised. In other words, nothing has changed in it, meaning that all this metadata is correct. And given that we have a thumbprint that is a hash of this thing, and if all the math and all the cryptography matches, it means that we can trust this certificate because we trust this certificate. And then the next question is, but do we trust this one? And we do the same thing for this certificate as we did for this one. We get the certificate of the higher standing CA, and we do exactly the same thing to verify if this certificate is right. And then it goes one level up, until we reach this root CA, which we originally decided to trust by default. Either because whoever made our operating system decided it's a good idea to trust it, or because I have, at some point, manually taken this certificate and installed it in my operating system. You can import a certificate, and it will be in this list. So, in this case, you can see the trust propagated from top to bottom.
What if a step in the ladder breaks?
If a step in this hierarchy breaks, you can use CMP, revoke. Let's say that this CA got compromised. As soon as people find out that this happened, they tell the higher standing CA to revoke my certificate because my key got compromised. So whenever we have to check this certificate, we check this one, then that one. And when we check this one, the CRL will contain the serial number. So this chain isn't built, so we know, I cannot trust this certificate. Why not? Because if somebody else has the secret key of this CA, they could have issued a certificate with the same metadata as this CA, and then they could have used this CA to issue a certificate with the same metadata as this one. So you can't trust it any longer. So in other words, it is really important to be able to provide feedback. If a secret key got stolen or somehow compromised, you have to let your higher level CA, you have to let them know about it. And you can do this using CMP. They will then update the CRL accordingly, or you can use OCSP to ask the CA if this specific certificate is still valid. Yeah?
I have a question, but if there are bad guys that just want to revoke certificates,
Mm-hmm.
what does they do in this case? For example,
Uh-huh.
a certificate is fully okay, but I decide to mark it as compromised or something.
And it's not your certificate.
No.
Okay, so let's say you have this person and their certificate, and the evil person, for some reason, decided to mess with them and tell the CA over CMP to revoke this certificate.
Or higher one.
Okay, got it. Well, when you receive a CMP request, you have to process it. And this process implies verifying where the request came from. You can do this entirely online, but according to the policy of one CA, you will only update the CRL if the person came to their office physically, showed them their passport, and wrote a cerere de annullare a certificatului, or something like that. So there is another series of papers that have to leave a trail to verify if this revocation request is authentic. What other questions do you have? Well, since it's a break, let's have a short break and then return.